The Equalities Act is playing out in a way that it becomes, unlike any other piece of legislation, it becomes the greatest kind of mover in terms of shaping our culture more broadly through sets of policies, workplace policies, codes of conducts, anti-racist charters, equity, diversity and inclusion.
Coming up on British thought leaders, Alka Sehgal Cuthbert says the Equality Act is not fit for purpose.
It's actually making the law politics itself.
Right.
And that's a profound, that has constitutional implications that really need scrutiny.
Alka says the Act is making us less free by facilitating state control.
The reach for the law and the state to influence, shape, regulate our relationships is enormous. And the fact you haven't got official governments in every workplace like you might have had in China or the Soviet Union doesn't prevent the legislation from being just as authoritarian.
She says the Equality Act is the legislative endorsement of a diverse Britain.
It's a multicultural state, and the Equality Act is the legislation that is expressing that multicultural state.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Alka Sehgal Cuthbert, Director of Don't Divide Us. Alka, welcome back.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you for inviting me again.
So we're talking about the Equality Act. I mean, it sounds great. It's hard to imagine a fairer sounding law than the Equality Act. But Don't Divide Us, you brought out a report saying it's not fit for purpose. Can you tell us a bit more?
Yes, I mean, you're right. I mean, who wants to be against equalities, right? It sounds like you want to kind of kill the Christmas fairy or something. But I think it's very important that we look beyond the label and look at actually what the Act consists of, and also how it's rolling out in practice, which is something I think not very many people have done, and what our report is fairly unique in doing, in looking empirically at how the provisions of the Equality Act are being utilised in the workplace in terms of workplace culture, that is, the relationships between employees, employers, employees, and the courts. I mean, the rise in litigation is quite extraordinary, and we have looked particularly at a sample of cases where race discrimination in particular, as opposed to sex or nationality or the other kind of protected groups. And you can see that only 5% of cases have been upheld. Yeah. Now, there are different ways of reading that. The activists who are committed to that sort of identitarian outlook could look at it and say, well, that just shows you how racist the judiciary is. But I mean, I think most people will be more sensible than that and think, well, there's something is happening that means ordinary people in the workplace are turning to litigation in increasing numbers and with increasing, speed and ease. It's like that's the go-to rather than the last resort thing that you do when you have a grievance or a complaint. It's like the go-to, and all the intermediary process of internal disciplinary meetings, the obligatory ACAS referral, just become like steps that you want to pass through as quickly as possible to get your day in the court, in the tribunal hearing. And that's very worrying, in a more granular way, at the qualitative aspects of this as well as the quantitative aspects. You can see how the Equalities Act is playing out in a way that it becomes, unlike any other piece of legislation, it becomes the greatest kind of mover in terms of shaping our culture more broadly through sets of policies, workplace policies, codes of conducts, anti-racist charters, equity, diversity and inclusion charters and commitments, all of which are not sort of officially legal, but they're kind of meant to make the culture nicer.
Right.
And explicit, you will find increasingly, it's said this is a way not just to make our existing culture nicer and kinder, but to change our culture, because our culture is assumed to be so irredeemably racist that you can't just make it a bit nicer, we need to change it. But doing it this way is profoundly anti-democratic. I mean, people can believe that if they want, but they need to be open and honest about it. And I think the Equality Act is making it very easy, not just for activists to use it in the way they want, because you could say, well, activists on both sides could use parts of the law, but it's doing something more significant. It's actually making the law politics itself.
Right.
And that's a profound, that has, you know, constitutional implications that really need scrutiny.
You have a section on the tribunals. What kind of numbers are we looking at in terms of where tribunals used to be a few years ago and where they are now, and how many are being rejected?
There's some leeway on this because the source, it's very hard. There's no stable source because the most official source, I mean, there are two government online sources that give you information about employment tribunals. One of them kind of gives you the overall kind of annual figures in different variations and combinations. But that didn't give us the qualitative data that we wanted. And then the other website is where the records of employment tribunal hearings are recorded and uploaded. But again, not all cases have the records. Records are only given if somebody requests them. And they're so behind, there's such a backlog, they're still updating cases from a few years ago. But we can see, in terms of overall employment tribunal cases, which may not all be equalities legislation related, some of them may be purely, you know, constructive dismissal or things to do with employment law rather than equalities law. But more often than not, lawyers, probably people with lawyers' encouragement, are combining the two. So if they think there's a constructive dismissal case that is a bit weak, they'll look for an equalities, equalities protection that they can add to the case to try and strengthen it up. So in terms of overall cases, since 2017, there have been over to 2024, there have been over 200,000 cases. Wow. Now, what is involved in a case is enormous, right? Even if most cases are not upheld, i.e. the employers aren't held to be liable, the cost for employers is quite significant because they will have had to find records and witnesses from possibly years ago, and depending on the kind of employer you are, you might have a high turnover of employees. So trying to trace somebody that worked in your place 3 years ago, say, would be not an easy thing. So it demands a significant costs in terms of time, effort and money, and of course to the claimant as well. And the whole, you can imagine the kind of, what this encourages then is it pushes employers to sort of try and enact further ways of risk limitation, of damage limitation. So they will then go to third-party organisations, pay them to come in to do the kind of checks and things to try and cover their backs, because frankly what they're being asked to do under the equalities legislation is far more than just do what they're meant to do and do it as fairly as they can, which is what most people would think of as normal and acceptable, not discriminate against anybody on the basis of their colour. No. The Equality Act is saying you've got to do much more than that. You have to be seen to be showing how you are advancing equality, how you are eliminating discrimination, and how you are fostering good relations. Now, each one of those has no limit, right? There's no definitional limit to that. And so the reach for the law and the state to influence, shape, regulate our relationships is enormous. And the fact you haven't got official governments in every workplace like you might have had in China or the Soviet Union doesn't prevent the legislation from being just as authoritarian, because what's happening is all these codes of conducts are coming in, all these EDI policies are coming in, which are making people self-censor. That people can't. We're working every day where you feel you're not sure if you can tell a joke or not. You have to double check everything.
The state policing our conversations, our relationships with others in public places?
It's the state having created and sanctioned and put forward this piece of legislation that is interacting with cultural trends, and there's a kind of feedback loop. And the effect of this is that we are more unfree. We're making ourselves more unfree because we kind of feel ourselves informally that our main aim is to make sure whatever we do doesn't hurt somebody who's vulnerable. So you're checking yourself constantly, and in that situation you cannot have the kind of free, spontaneous relationships that you need to build any kind of proper friendship, rather than some kind of weird alliance based on fear and punishment.
The subtitle of your report talks about this breakdown in informal civility in the workplace. Where is this kind of grievance culture that's replacing our informal civility culture coming from? It can't be just the Act. What else is contributing to it? No,
it's not just the Act, but I mean, I think the thing is that the Act is the kind of really huge legislative endorsement of cultural trends that have been being enacted in our society for quite a long time, well before the Equality Act. The first Equality Act was 2006. And what we're seeing is it is, if you think about it, it is almost like it's the legal expression of a shift in legal and political and cultural paradigm from the nation to multiculturalism. It's a multicultural state, and the Equality Act is the legislation that is expressing that multicultural state. So we don't. It's like we don't see ourselves so much anymore as citizens of a nation state and equal in that way politically, or the other source traditionally has been religion. Your moral equals under God. But now it's like you have to. We look for status and validation from external sources, and that creates a kind of competition. And these kinds of things were inherent in the logic of multiculturalism that's been in our culture more broadly for a lot longer. But the Equality Act is really turbocharging it because it's legally endorsing it explicitly.
Do you think we'll see a pushback from corporations? Surely they don't want to spend so much time and money on tribunals.
Well, I mean, people look to America, where some corporations have abandoned their EDI policies following Trump's election. But I mean, you've got to remember, in Britain, a large part of our economy is not large corporations, it's small and medium enterprises. So they're not going to have, a corporation can easily kind of rock with whichever way the wind is blowing. If it's EDI, they'll go with that. If it isn't, they'll abandon it just as easily. The commitment was never very real in terms of, ethical commitment. But I think for a lot of other businesses, they won't have the money to risk it, right? They won't have the money to risk it. And with the current talk of Labour introducing a new race equality charter that will impose even more administrative duties on employers, with the threat of even more litigation, I can't see this going away. I can only see this getting worse until it's actively challenged and repealed, but repealed after a review, because we've only looked at race. We wouldn't want to say get rid of it without looking at what the provisions are for disability, and other groups.
I mean, you mentioned the government there. It seems they're going in the opposite direction from what we're talking about, consulting on a new beefed-up version of the Equality Act. Can you talk to us a bit more about that?
Honestly, Lee, I don't know what is going on inside their heads. I don't know that I want to. Their response to our report indirectly, when, other press have asked the government for a comment, has been that they're very proud of the Equality Act for the protections that it offers the individual, which to me just says they don't really understand their own act, because it doesn't offer protections for the individual. It offers protection for the individuals if the individuals accept the premise that they are members of a protected group.
Yeah.
Well, that's group identity, that's not individual, you know, presenting yourself under a national law and, you know, which you expect to be applied universally. Now you can see you present yourself as a part of a group, and you expect the law is expected to adjust according to, you know, some unwritten scale of disadvantage and hierarchy of victimhood, which is why we rightly see and object to, well, many of us do, to what we call, you know, a two-tier justice system emerging. So I think they're just blind to what they've actually done. I think either they're blind to it and they don't know, or they know what they're doing and they don't care. For them, this is their, you know, they will be very stuck to it because it gives them a role, you know, they're the ones having to negotiate, they're the ones having to, they don't care that everybody else around them is kind of, you know, it's conflict ridden and there's more fractiousness, because they just say, okay, well, you know, let's see what we can do about this. Let's see what body we can set up to, you know, more and more legislation, rather than understanding that was the source of the problem to begin with. Mm.
So this Act was brought in at a time before identity politics was as strong as it is now. I mean, is it the Act itself the problem, or is it this kind of a progressive interpretation of it by the courts, etc.?
I think it's both. I mean, I think it would be too easy and incorrect to blame the conflict that we're seeing as a failure of implementation alone, because on the kind of scale that we're seeing, it's not just a failure. You know, you haven't got 95% of the cases that are not being upheld can be attributed to people not getting it wrong. It's in the wording of the Act, particularly the public sector equality duty, is so wide, it's so general, nobody can really define it, you know. I mean, could you define what it means to advance equality?
No.
I mean, barristers can't, so I doubt Keir Starmer could. I doubt Harriet Harman could when it was introduced in 2010. It just sounds nice, doesn't it? You know, we all want to be equal, so... You know, with no thought of what they're actually doing when they're saying, well, we're going to use the law to make you equal. Well, when did anybody need a law to say that we were equal human beings? You know, it's just ludicrous. So I don't think it is just, it's not implemented, it's in the legislation, but also what you have had since the legislation, you have had the establishment of a veritable industry of diversity, equality or equity, diversity, inclusion, that has now, you know, become entrenched within our workplace, and that's private and public institutions. Now, private institutions, as you referred to earlier, can kind of ditch it more easily when they want to. But if you take something like the National Health Service, the largest single employer in Britain, well, since 2010, when the Act was introduced, they have been institutionalising what's called the workplace racial equality standards, which is basically giving the go-ahead for hospital trusts regionally to set about establishing little groups in their area to find ways of monitoring their racial diversity performance. And that's what's giving rise to positive action schemes, to all the monitoring that we see going on. To, you know, sort of basically policies like leadership schemes or schemes of progression, but for black people only. But that's segregation, right? That you know, you can call it what you like, but in fact it is segregation. It is saying, you know, providing a service for some people on the basis of their skin colour and not for other people on the basis of their skin colour. And that's actually prohibited by one single one-line section in the Equality Act, section 13(5), which says segregation is prohibited. But the whole cultural weight and the kind of way the culture and the Act are kind of reinforcing each other has meant that little section's been ignored, but all the positive action, the positive duty, that has been really ramped up. But there's actually one nurse, Carol Richardson, who's going to test this in court to say, you know, look, can anybody here say what is the difference between positive action and segregation, when her employer's a hospital up in the near York, I think it is, you know, introduced one of these schemes just for black people. When she queried it, she was told, well, your colleagues need a safe space. And she thought, safe from me? What, you know, the people you've been working alongside with for years. Why do they need a space that's safe from her because she's white? You know, it's just so it's very divisive and very insulting, I think, both to black and white people, actually.
So what recommendations are you putting forward?
There are two aspects of it that could be repealed immediately, we think, without with only good results, and that would be getting rid of the public sector equality duty, which is the bit that says you've got to advance equality, eliminate discrimination, and foster good relations. I mean, utopian or what? It's, so that needs to, the law shouldn't be like that. It should be very specific and well defined. So that should go, and probably positive action should go. My caveat for that would be, we were saying, you know, then have a proper legal review of all the other things, and maybe disability might be one area where there could be space for a legitimate, you know, reason to have positive action. I don't know. We haven't. That's not what we've looked at. But somebody in charge needs to be looking at it properly, and so a legal review of all the Equality Act as a whole, with a view to repealing it. And seeing, you know, people always sort of gasp a little bit. It's like, to get rid of the Equality Act, well, what will you replace it with? And of course, what they don't realise is that a lot of the protections in the Equality Act already exist in existing employment law, in health and safety legislation, in workers' rights. You know, there's a whole raft of things that, frankly, have enabled Britain to get from, you know, to make the cultural and racial progress it's made in terms of race relations from the 60s to the, you know, 2000s without the Equality Act. You know, so those protections probably already exist in existing law. So the legal review should obviously look at what already exists. If there's anything unique to the Equality Act, then we need a discussion. Is it something that is in keeping with a traditional, if you like, classical liberal legal paradigm where you stand before the court and you expect the law to be applied universally, or is it you know, is it something that belongs to this kind of new social justice legal paradigm, in which case it probably needs to go.
So if we did follow those recommendations, how do you think that would affect the workplaces? What changes would we see?
You know, nobody goes to work having read the law or the Equality Act, or, you know, that isn't how it works. I think what it will do, a bit like, for example, the Supreme Court ruling on the women question recently, you know, there's been a backlash to that. I mean, so in one sense it will clarify those who are really against it and those who are kind of the majority with a common sense view, and the kind of real activists, the real diehard people. But also it will kind of just give confidence, so that there was that BBC presenter, you know, that sort of automatically corrected herself and said, women, you know. Well, that's exactly the kind of freedom of speech that the Equality Act dampens. So if we get rid of it, you'd hope that the effects would be, over time, I don't think it will happen immediately, but more and more people will just feel more confident to speak freely. That's all we want, right? It's a kind of lifting of a yoke that will allow problems to be seen more clearly and not presented in a reified way.
I want to just end with a wider question. 5 years ago, you started Don't Divide Us after the George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter protests, etc., looking at anti-racism and the kind of racism that was involved in that, really, and the problems that came from some of that. And do you think 5 years later things have gone in the right direction? Are things better now? Yes
and no. I think what is good is that people are questioning it now. There is a pushback. All sorts of different groups are questioning it because the effects of it are becoming so much clearer. The contradictions of it, the cruelty of it, you know, as we're seeing more and more people, we've seen more and more people cancelled for things that people really just genuinely don't understand what on earth is wrong. What on earth is wrong with saying you believe in Martin Luther King colourblind racism. That should not be a cause for somebody to be given the cold shoulder at work, let alone dismissed or anything like that. So that's really good. But at the same time, it has become so very much entrenched, and you know, it's not sort of been done in an explicit way. It is like a kind of quiet revolution that's happened bit by bit. So you know, most people tend to go along with a lot of these measures and policies and initiatives, because they are just seen in terms of, well, you know, in Britain we are better off than a lot of countries abroad, so yeah, we should be nice. Yeah, we should we should try and help them. Yes, we should. Yes, we should. Yes, we should. Yes, we should end up paying reparations, or yes, we should, you know, be less proud about our culture, or not flaunt the fact that we like a lot of things that Britain has done historically. It hasn't all been bad, you know. So that, you know, that creates, so that kind of cultural shaming, that distancing from our own history, are things that will take longer, I think, to repair and to restore, because they haven't been taken on consciously particularly. So you have to, you know, it's a kind of case of being able to explain in a way that makes sense to people that this is not the harmless thing you think it is, without kind of feeding conspiracy theories. It's just a kind of an organic, spontaneous thing that's happened because of various political conjunctures that have all combined to make people very open to this. You know, for a lot of people, this outlook provides a way of making meaning in their lives because there isn't much else around. So, so in that sense, even though there's a pushback, it's just the beginning. But hey, a beginning's better than not a beginning. So positive, but also realising there's the work to be done is huge.
Alka Sehgal Cuthbert, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.